Here's something that should bother you more than it does. You have lived an entire chapter of your life, a full, complete, experience-rich chapter spanning roughly the first 2 to 3 years of your existence, and you remember none of it. Not fragments, not impressions, not even a blurry outline of something that might have been real. Nothing. A total, clean, absolute blackout covering a period during which you were awake, alert, emotionally responsive, learning at a rate you will never again match in your entire life, and apparently having experiences vivid enough to make you cry, laugh, reach for things, and recognize the faces of the people you loved most. That happened. All of it happened, and you have zero access to any of it. Think about how strange that actually is. You can probably remember something from when you were 5 or 6. Maybe a birthday, maybe a specific afternoon, maybe the smell of a particular room. But below a certain threshold, somewhere around age 2, sometimes 3, the record just stops. Not fades. Stops. Like someone reached into your personal archive and pulled out the first few years of footage and replaced it with static. You have photographs of yourself as a baby. You've seen them. That's you. That's your face, your body, presumably your experience. And that person is, for all practical memory purposes, a complete stranger. This phenomenon has a name: infantile amnesia, sometimes called childhood amnesia, and it has puzzled psychologists, neuroscientists, and philosophers for well over a century. Sigmund Freud wrote about it. He was wrong about most of his explanation, but at least he noticed the problem. The question of why this happens is more layered, more contested, and more revelatory about how memory actually works than most people realize. Because the answer isn't simple. There isn't one clean mechanism that explains everything. There are several overlapping factors, each interesting on its own, and together they paint a picture of human memory that is considerably stranger than the filing cabinet metaphor most of us walk around with. So here's the actual story. Start with what the brain of a newborn human actually is, because this is where most explanations of infantile amnesia begin, and where most popular summaries stop too early and miss the interesting parts. A newborn human brain weighs roughly 300 to 400 grams and contains approximately 100 billion neurons, roughly the same number as an adult brain. That part surprises people. The neurons are mostly there from the beginning. What isn't there, what develops over the months and years that follow, is the connectivity between those neurons. The synaptic connections, the myelination of axons, the organizational architecture that allows neurons to communicate efficiently, and form the kinds of networks that underlie complex cognitive functions. All of that is dramatically underdeveloped at birth. Human infants are, by the standards of most mammals, born absurdly early relative to developmental completeness. A foal can walk within hours of birth. A human infant cannot even support its own head. This is partly due to the constraints of bipedalism. The human pelvis, reshaped for upright walking, cannot accommodate a fully developed brain passing through it at birth, so humans are born with brains that are still in an early stage of structural development. The consequence is that an enormous amount of brain development that other mammals complete in the womb, humans complete in the first years of postnatal life. In a very real sense, a human infant is still a fetus in terms of neural development, just one that happens to be outside the body. This matters enormously for memory. The hippocampus is the brain structure most centrally involved in the formation of episodic memories, the kind of memories that have autobiographical content, the kind that tell the story of your life. Episodic memory is specifically, I was there, this happened, I experienced this. It's the memory of events as events, with temporal and contextual information attached. When you remember your 7th birthday party, you're using episodic memory. The hippocampus is the gateway through which experiences become retrievable memories of this type. In human infants, the hippocampus is structurally immature and, critically, is still generating new neurons throughout the first years of life. This ongoing neurogenesis, which sounds like it should be a good thing, is actually part of the problem. The continuous production and integration of new neurons into hippocampal circuits disrupts existing neural networks. New neurons, as they wire in and form connections, effectively destabilize the circuits that previously encoded memories. Memories that were stored in one hippocampal network configuration become inaccessible when that network is reorganized by the arrival of new neurons. This is called neurogenesis-mediated forgetting, and research across multiple species supports it as a significant mechanism. Animals with high rates of hippocampal neurogenesis show higher rates of early memory loss. When neurogenesis is experimentally suppressed in young animals, their early memories persist longer. When neurogenesis is artificially elevated in adult animals, those animals show infantile amnesia, like forgetting of recent experiences. The new neurons aren't just adding capacity, they're overwriting the existing architecture. And the memories encoded in that architecture go with it. So part of why you don't remember being a baby is that your baby brain was continuously renovating itself in ways that made it structurally impossible to maintain the memories it was forming. The construction was destroying the records at the same time it was building the building. But neurogenesis alone doesn't fully explain infantile amnesia, because the amnesia persists well past the period of most intense hippocampal neurogenesis. Children at age 3 or 4 are still forming poor autobiographical memories relative to what they'll be capable of at 7 or 8, even though the most intense period of hippocampal development has already passed. Something else is also happening. That something else is language. And its role in memory is more profound than most people intuitively grasp. Memory researchers distinguish between different types of memory storage and retrieval, and one crucial dimension is the role of verbal encoding. When you have an experience and simultaneously narrate it, either out loud or internally in language, that narration creates an additional layer of encoding. The experience becomes not just a sensory and emotional impression, but also a verbal representation. Later, when you try to retrieve that experience, you can access it through the verbal pathway, which turns out to be very efficient for the kind of conscious, deliberate recollection we usually mean when we say, "I remember something." Infants and very young children don't have language. This sounds obvious. The less obvious implication is that they are encoding experiences without the verbal scaffold that makes later deliberate retrieval possible. Their memories exist, to the extent they exist, in a format that the verbal, narratively organized adult mind cannot easily access. By the time a child develops sufficient language to start verbally encoding experiences, the early pre-verbal memories are stored in a format that doesn't interface well with the verbal retrieval systems the older brain primarily uses. Think of it as a file format problem. The early memories were saved in a format that the later operating system can't read. The files might still be there. There's some evidence that implicit, non-declarative traces of early experience persist into adulthood, but the adult mind, reaching for a memory through verbal and narrative channels, finds nothing retrievable. This also helps explain why the age at which childhood amnesia ends is not fixed across cultures. Research comparing children from different cultural backgrounds found that children raised in cultures with strong traditions of personal storytelling, where parents regularly talk with their children about shared past experiences, constructing verbal narratives of events together, tend to have earlier first memories, and richer early autobiographical recall than children from cultures where shared reminiscing is less emphasized. The practice of talking about the past with children helps children develop the verbal encoding habits that make memories stick in a retrievable form. Memory, in this sense, is partly a learned social skill. It requires the cultural scaffolding of shared narration to reach its full capacity. The self is another dimension that complicates all of this, and it's one of the more philosophically interesting layers of the infantile amnesia puzzle. Episodic memory doesn't just require a hippocampus and language, it also requires what researchers call a self-concept, a stable sense of oneself as a continuous entity persisting through time, around which experiences can be organized and attributed. I was there, this happened to me, I felt this. All of those statements require a functional I. They require an experiencing subject who has a consistent identity to whom experiences can be attached. Infants don't have this in the same way adults do. The development of a stable self-concept is a gradual process that unfolds through the first few years of life. The classic test for self-recognition is the mirror test. Does an animal or child recognize their own reflection as themselves? Most human infants pass this test somewhere around 18 months to 2 years of age. Before that point, the infant may not have a stable enough self-concept to organize experiences around an I who is having them. Memories that aren't organized around a stable I are not autobiographical memories. They might be implicit traces, patterns of preference, conditioned responses, emotional associations, but they're not the kind of retrievable episodic memories that constitute the story of your life. To remember something as something that happened to you, you need to have had a continuous you for it to happen to. Early infants are still building that you. And experiences that occurred before the self was stable enough to anchor them don't get attached to the continuous narrative that becomes autobiographical memory. This creates a slightly vertiginous philosophical question. Were you there? In the experiential sense, something was there. A small human was having experiences. But the you that could have a continuous relationship to those experiences, the narrative self that connects your present consciousness to your past, wasn't fully assembled yet. The experiences happened in the absence of the self that would remember them. They happened to someone who wasn't quite you yet in the sense that memory requires. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Now, here's the part that doesn't fit neatly into any single explanatory framework and tends to get left out of simpler accounts. Babies are learning constantly, and some of what they learn persists in ways that never become conscious memories. This is the implicit memory distinction, and it completely undermines any simple story about babies not forming memories. A newborn baby quickly learns to prefer the smell of its mother over other smells. This is learning. The preference persists. But the adult doesn't consciously remember acquiring that preference. A baby who has a frightening experience in a hospital setting may show stress responses to medical environments years later without any conscious memory of the original experience. Conditioning, emotional associations, skill acquisition. All of these involve memory formation that happens in infancy and persists in some form into adulthood. Studies have shown that very young infants can learn specific sequences of movements and retain that learning for weeks. Language acquisition itself is one of the most dramatic feats of learning in human existence, and it happens largely in the period covered by infantile amnesia. So the brain was forming memories during infancy, just not the kind of memories you can consciously access. The systems for implicit memory, the cerebellum, the basal ganglia, the amygdala's emotional learning circuits, are functional much earlier than the hippocampal episodic memory system. What develops later, what comes online gradually through the first years of life, is specifically the capacity for explicit, conscious, autobiographical recollection. The memories that can't be retrieved aren't necessarily gone. They may be stored in formats that influence behavior and emotion, without ever surfacing as conscious recollection. There is something quietly strange about this. The idea that your earliest experiences might be shaping you in ways you can't access, that the emotional climate of your first years left marks that you carry but cannot read. Attachment researchers have documented that early caregiving experiences predict adult relationship patterns in ways that don't operate through conscious memory of specific events. The body knows things the mind can't report. This brings us to what might be the most unsettling implication of infantile amnesia, which is the question of what babies are experiencing during the period they won't remember. Because the evidence is clear that babies are experiencing things, real things, intense things. Babies experience pain. Neonates show physiological and behavioral stress responses to painful procedures that parallel those of older children. Babies experience fear, pleasure, comfort, distress, something that looks behaviorally indistinguishable from joy. They form attachments. They have preferences. They respond emotionally to the emotional states of the people around them. The emotional life of an infant is active and rich and consequential. None of this is in dispute. The dispute is about what that experience is like from the inside. Whether there is something it is like to be a baby in the philosophical sense, whether there is subjective, phenomenal experience accompanying the behavioral and physiological responses, is a question that cannot be definitively answered because subjective experience isn't directly observable. But most researchers working in infant cognition treat the behavioral and physiological evidence as strongly suggesting genuine experience, even if the nature of that experience differs from adult conscious experience. So we have a situation in which rich, emotionally significant experiences occur. Experiences of comfort and fear, of faces and voices, of hunger and satiation, of love and neglect. And then those experiences become inaccessible to the future person who lived through them. The experiences were real. Their inaccessibility is a feature of the retrieval system, not necessarily of the original experience. This is worth pausing on. The person you are today has been shaped by experiences you cannot remember. The emotional tone of your earliest relationships, the quality of care you received, the stresses and comforts of your first environment. These things influenced your neurodevelopment during the period of most intense brain construction, during the years when the architecture of your emotional regulation, your attachment patterns, your baseline stress response was being laid down. And you have no direct access to those experiences through memory. You're living with their effects without being able to examine their causes. There's ongoing debate in psychology about whether this matters clinically, whether working with early childhood experiences in therapy is valuable precisely because those experiences shaped the nervous system in ways that persist below the level of conscious recollection. The answer seems to be yes, in complicated ways that aren't fully understood yet. One more layer because any explanation that leaves out the memory itself, the nature of how young children actually do remember things before they forget them, is missing something important. Young children do form episodic memories. Researchers have shown this clearly through interviews with children shortly after events. 3-year-olds can describe recent experiences with reasonable accuracy. They have access to memories of things that happened months ago. Their early memories exist temporarily before they're lost. The loss isn't just a failure to encode in the first place. It's also active forgetting, a process by which memories that were formed are subsequently lost through the mechanisms described earlier: neurogenesis, lack of verbal consolidation, developing self-concept. The child who tells you about a birthday party at age 3 may have no access to that memory by age 7. The forgetting happens after the fact. This means infantile amnesia isn't purely about babies being incapable of experiencing or forming memories. It's about those memories failing to make the transition into the long-term autobiographical storage system of the adult mind. The gap between child brain and adult brain is wide enough that much of what the child experienced doesn't successfully translate across it. It's like trying to run software from one operating system on a completely different one. The data was there. The execution environment changed so dramatically that the data became unreadable by the new system. Research continues into exactly where the boundary falls and what determines it. There's evidence that the earliest memories people retain tend to be emotionally significant rather than ordinary, which aligns with the role of the amygdala in emotional memory consolidation, where emotional intensity enhances encoding and persistence. Your first retained memory is more likely to be something startling, frightening, or joyful than a routine Tuesday afternoon. The emotional charge drove extra consolidation through a system that was functional before the full episodic memory architecture came online. There's also evidence that the age of first memory varies across individuals, and that this variation is meaningful. People who experienced highly stressful early childhoods sometimes have earlier first memories, possibly because chronic stress hormones accelerated certain aspects of memory-related brain development, or because the emotional intensity of stressful experiences drove stronger encoding. The first memory you have, and how early it is, may itself carry information about what your early life was like, even if the memory's content seems mundane. So circle back to the beginning. You lived a full, rich, experience-saturated chapter of your existence. Your brain was developing at a rate it will never approach again. Your emotional systems were active and responsive. The people who cared for you were your entire world. And you remember none of it because the brain you did all of that experiencing with was so different from the brain you have now. So much less structurally organized, so actively under construction, so lacking in the verbal and self-conceptual scaffolding that adult memory requires, that the memories couldn't make the journey forward with you. The you that was there was real, The experiences were real. The forgetting was also real, and it was built into the developmental process that turned an infant nervous system into an adult one. What makes infantile amnesia worth understanding isn't just the neuroscience, though the neuroscience is fascinating. What makes it worth understanding is what it reveals about the nature of memory itself. Memory is not a recording device that captured everything and stores it faithfully. Memory is a construction system that selectively encodes, actively reorganizes, and continuously revises. The self that remembers is not separate from the process of remembering. It's partly constituted by it. The story of your life that you carry around is a story that begins after the most formative chapter ended, constructed by a mind that didn't yet exist when that chapter was being written. You started becoming you before you could remember being you. The construction was well underway before the record started. And the person who went through all of that, the one in the photographs, on the floor, learning to walk and talk and recognize faces and make sense of a world that must have been enormous and bewildering and overwhelming, that person did all of that without leaving you any notes, which is either poignant or deeply inconvenient, depending on what kind of mood you're in. Probably both.